In the remote Ork Mountain region of Missouri, deep within the heart of the mountains, there exists a story that few are aware of and even fewer have the courage to share. Families lived in isolation for generations, nestled between valleys and thick forests that kept the sunlight at bay, establishing their own secluded world with its own set of rules. It was in 1978 that a rural physician, Dr. Robert Lawn, first documented the case of the Whitaker sisters. Elalina, Margaret, and Ruth, born between 1932 and 1937, were the offspring of first-degree cousins, who themselves came from a lineage marked by centuries of intermarriage among relatives. On my first visit to that property, I observed something unusual, Dr. Lawn recorded in his medical diary, a document now archived at the University of Missouri. The curtains were always drawn, even during daylight. The older brother, Thomas, who appeared to be the only one without any visible deformities, greeted me. What the doctor encountered inside that remote house would leave a lasting impression on him throughout his professional life. The three sisters exhibited significant facial abnormalities, jaws that were out of alignment, eyes that were asymmetrical, cranial malformations, and severe dental issues. Even more striking was the fact that they all wore masks crafted from cloth, even when inside their home and in the presence of family members. Elalina, the eldest, was the one who first took off her mask so I could perform an examination, Liston recounted. The look of pain in her eyes when she noticed my initial response is something I will never forget. Medical examinations determined that the Whitaker sisters had mandibular facial dysostosis, an uncommon genetic disorder typically linked to Treacher-Collins syndrome, but with especially severe symptoms because of the successive consanguineous marriages. Later reviews of parish registries and local census data confirmed at least 7 generations of unions between cousins within the family. The outside world remained unaware of the sisters' existence until 1983, when a short reference in a regional medical journal attracted the interest of the scientific community. Nevertheless, the family steadfastly rejected any kind of public attention, shielding the sisters from societal judgment. The Whitaker sisters' story is not an isolated incident. Rather, it exemplifies a wider trend in remote rural communities throughout America. In these areas, geographic, cultural, and religious seclusion created an environment where consanguineous marriage practices continued long after they had been generally abandoned elsewhere. Check to see if you're already subscribed to this channel. Cases similar to the Whitaker sisters are seldom documented with such thoroughness, and our research brings to light narratives that society often chooses to overlook. To truly grasp the tragedy of women who concealed their faces behind masks, we must comprehend the scientific basis of their condition. Dr. James Warren, a geneticist at the University of Columbia who investigated comparable cases in 1992, clarifies, consanguinity itself doesn't generate new genetic mutations. What it does is heighten the probability that detrimental recessive genes, which would typically remain dormant for generations, become expressed when the same genetic variant is passed down from both parents. In the Whitaker sisters' particular case, subsequent genetic testing uncovered an exceptional buildup of harmful recessive alleles, a kind of ideal genetic storm that resulted in the severe deformities they experienced. Medical records from Shannon County, Missouri, kept in the State Historical Archive, indicate that between 1920 and 1970, the rate of congenital defects in this area was 47% above the national average. A public health report from 1965, kept classified for decades because of worries about stigmatizing the community, recorded clusters of congenital malformations in certain families. The communities of the Ork Mountains developed a triple layer of isolation, explains anthropologist Dr. Sarah Mackenzie, who has researched the region for 20 years. First, geographic isolation due to poor roads and difficult landscape. Second, cultural isolation, marked by a deep mistrust of outsiders. And third, genetic isolation, resulting from a restricted pool of possible partners. This isolation wasn't accidental. Historical documents reveal that many of these families intentionally fled the observation of mainstream society. The Whitaker family, for instance, were among the settlers who established themselves in the area during the 1830s, intentionally picking remote lands to escape religious persecution. The community developed marriage customs that encouraged unions within the same family network, frequently rationalized by particular religious views and the necessity of keeping land within the family. Church records from 1875 show a local pastor endorsing marriages between cousins as something blessed by the Lord to preserve the family line. In 1952, when Elenina Whitaker was 20, a traveling doctor proposed surgical treatment to ease their deformities. The family turned it down. According to Dr. Lon's account, they perceived the girl's condition not as a sickness but as a divine challenge that should be endured with dignity. The masks developed as a pragmatic response. Initially sewn by the girl's mother and later by the sisters themselves, the masks were meticulously made from dark fabrics, covering most of the face with only the eyes exposed. Uncommon photographs kept in Dr. Lon's medical archive show that the masks were remarkably detailed, featuring embroidered patterns that hinted at an idealized face. The tragic irony is that the very isolation that contributed to their conditions also shielded them from the harsh public judgment they would undoubtedly have encountered in the outside world. In the limited interviews granted to Dr. Lon between 1978 and 1985, gathered in his confidential medical archive, partially released for study in 2010, the Whitaker sisters disclosed glimpses of their remarkable lives. Margaret, the middle sister, described her daily schedule. "We got up before dawn to handle the outdoor chores. It's better to work when it's dark." The three sisters developed a careful system to reduce their exposure. They maintained a garden behind the property, surrounded by tall trees, and raised chickens and goats, animals that, as they noted, were unconcerned with appearances. Their brother Thomas managed all contact with the outside world, including shopping in town, negotiations, and banking. Elon was the finest seamstress I ever encountered, an elderly neighbor recounted in 1992, who occasionally swapped eggs for embroidery with the family. "I never saw her face, but her hands produced genuine works of art." The Whitaker house, documented in scarce photos from the county archive, was a two-story building with small windows and curtains that were perpetually drawn. Inside, according to descriptions, it was remarkably tidy and orderly, with mirrors notably missing. The living room walls displayed photographs of ancestors from earlier generations, before the severe deformities appeared. Ruth, the youngest sister, maintained a thorough diary, partly preserved in the archives of the Missouri Historical Society. In a 1965 entry, she wrote, "Today I caught my reflection in the well water for a moment in the dusk light, and it almost seemed normal. I imagined what it would be like to walk through town without causing stares or being shunned." The masks evolved into more than simple coverings, they became substitute identities. Each sister possessed several masks for various occasions. Eleanor, the most adept with needle and thread, crafted masks with subtly different expressions, one with a slight smile for special days, another more plain for everyday use. "The most remarkable thing," Dr. Liston wrote, "is that even when they are alone in the house, they rarely take the masks off. Margaret explained to me that they've grown so accustomed to wearing them that they feel exposed without them." The occasional visitors who entered the home, mainly Dr. Liston and sometimes the local pastor, noted that the sisters appeared to have developed a sophisticated body language to compensate for their limited facial expression. Hand movements, head tilts, and changes in posture communicated feelings that their covered faces couldn't convey. Medical records indicate that, besides their facial deformities, the sisters dealt with additional health issues. Eleanor had severe scoliosis, Margaret experienced progressive hearing loss, and Ruth suffered from chronic breathing difficulties, all symptoms consistent with syndromes linked to extended consanguinity. If you're also moved by the weight of this story, leave a comment now. Behind every mask, there is a spirit yearning for respect. The lives of these women remind us how acceptance and compassion are gifts that many have never experienced. The Whitaker sisters' narrative, while remarkable, is not singular. Research carried out by the Institute of Human Genetics at Johns Hopkins University from 1985 to 1997 identified at least 27 family clusters in the Americas with similar patterns of genetic seclusion and high rates of consanguineous marriages, leading to concentrations of severe genetic disorders. In 1976, medical anthropologist Dr. Eduardo documented the situation of veiled women in a remote community in the mountains of Chihuahua, Mexico. 5 women from the same broad family exhibited facial deformities comparable to those of the Whitaker sisters and embraced similar concealment methods. Doctor noted that the masks had become part of their cultural identity, turning a necessity into a tradition. In the Appalachian region, which spans several eastern U.S. states, a study of isolated community health conducted between 1970 and 1982 found multiple instances of congenital malformations in communities with elevated endogamy rates. This study, contentious at the time for its ethical and social consequences, stayed partially confidential until 2005. The Melungeon community, an isolated triracial population in the Appalachians, had documented cases in Hancock County, Tennessee. Rural Dr. William Kennedy recorded in 1963, "I encountered 4 adult women wearing permanent veils, all from the same family line. Local residents honor their privacy, but outsiders frequently react with cruelty." In Nova Scotia, Canada, the small community of Fisher's Harbour saw the case of the Whitaker Sisters, descendants of Scottish settlers who arrived in 1820 and stayed exceptionally isolated. The 3 sisters, born in the 1940s, had significant facial deformities resulting from multiple generations of cousin marriages. Parish records verify 7 first-cousin unions across just 3 generations. The isolation of these communities wasn't just geographical but also informational. An analysis of medical records from the Appalachian region carried out by Dr. Harold Mitchell in 1988 showed that fundamental knowledge about genetic risks connected to consanguineous marriages rarely reached these isolated communities. When it did, it was frequently dismissed as outside interference with established customs. In a 1990 interview with the medical journal Frontiers in Genetics, an unidentified woman referred to as MS from an isolated Kentucky community, who also used a mask to hide severe facial deformities, stated, "Nobody informed us that marrying cousins could lead to issues. It was simply what everyone did. My parents were cousins. My grandparents were cousins. When my face began to develop differently, everyone just thought it was misfortune." A consistent pattern emerged from these various cases. Geographic seclusion paved the way for genetic seclusion, frequently strengthened by religious or cultural beliefs that encouraged marriages within the same community or family. The resulting social stigma deepened this isolation, establishing a cycle that continued for generations. Dr. Paul Bergman, a geneticist who studied multiple cases, observed in 1990, "The more troubling element isn't the genetic conditions themselves, but how the reaction to these conditions frequently worsened the suffering of the affected families." Public health records reveal that in many of these situations, fundamental medical interventions that could have alleviated some complications were declined or never proposed. Isolation, initially a cause of the conditions, also turned into a barrier to treatment. Investigative journalist Michael Harkins, who attempted to document some of these cases in 1988, wrote, "I encountered closed doors, unanswered calls, and occasionally implied threats. These communities have learned through difficult experience that exposure seldom brings advantages and often leads to humiliation." Anthropologist Dr. Caroline Fisher, who has studied isolated communities for 3 decades, notes, "The use of masks, veils, or other methods of concealment became more than a practical response to physical abnormalities. In numerous instances, it developed into a distinct cultural expression, almost a form of defiance against a world that rejected them." Time did not stand still in the Ork Mountains. In 1987, Elenina Whitaker passed away at 55 from respiratory complications, a secondary issue related to her craniofacial malformations. Margaret followed in 1995 at 61. Ruth, the youngest, lived until 2002, dying at 65. The family home, left empty after Ruth's death and that of her brother Thomas in 1998, remained for years as a quiet monument to lives lived in obscurity. In 2008, a fire destroyed the structure, erasing the last physical remnants of that extraordinary family. Yet, the legacy of the Whitaker sisters and comparable women across the Americas endures in unforeseen ways. In 1992, the Craniofacial Anomalies Foundation was established, partly motivated by the cases documented by Dr. Liston. The foundation provides surgical treatment and psychological assistance for children and adults with severe facial malformations. Dr. Rachel Cohen, a plastic surgeon focusing on facial reconstruction, remarked in 2010, "Cases like the Whitaker sisters demonstrate the human toll of shortcomings in our healthcare systems and social support networks. Nowadays, many of these conditions can be addressed with fairly simple surgical procedures if identified early. Progress in genetic counseling and prenatal diagnostic methods means that many of the conditions that afflicted them can be avoided or treated. However, the social stigma linked to facial deformities continues, though in more subtle forms. The 1999 discovery of some of the Whitaker sisters' original masks, preserved by a neighbor after Ruth's death, offered surprising perspectives. The masks, now part of the University of Missouri's permanent collection, reveal an extraordinary level of craftsmanship, made with multiple layers of fabric meticulously stitched. Each mask possesses subtly defined facial features, defined cheek contours, a suggestion of lips, even embroidered eyebrows. These aren't just practical coverings, noted museum curator Dr. Elizabeth Chen. They are efforts to recreate the facial normality that genetics denied them. There is a touching dignity in this endeavor. In an uncommon 1980 interview with Drive Lawn, Ruth Whitaker explained the mask's importance to her and her sisters. People think we wear them to conceal ourselves, and that's partly true. But we also wear them to show ourselves in a way we choose. When I make a mask, I decide who I'll be that day. It's a power my real face never provided. Ruth's diary, spanning nearly 4 decades of her life, offers moving glimpses of a thoughtful and deeply sensitive woman. In a 1972 entry, she wrote, "Some people think we live tragic lives, stuck in this house with these faces, but we also know joy. When Eleanor plays piano at dusk. When Margaret tells stories that make us laugh until we cry. When Thomas returns from town with a new book for us to read together. In those moments, I completely forget about the masks." In isolated rural communities, consanguineous marriage practices have decreased significantly in recent decades because of greater mobility, improved educational access, and heightened awareness of genetic risks. Nevertheless, in some remote areas of the Americas, genetic isolation continues as a public health challenge. A 2018 study on marriage patterns in isolated communities, published by the National Institutes of Health, documented an 87% reduction in first-cousin marriages in U.S. rural areas since 1950. However, the same study pinpointed pockets where endogamous practices persist, especially in communities with strong religious or cultural seclusion. The accounts of women who lived behind masks remind us of the enduring influence of social stigma and the remarkable human ability to withstand adversity. As Ruth Whitaker wrote in her diary in a 1997 entry, "Behind this mask, I have led a full life, limited in some aspects, yes, but abundant in others. I have experienced love, beauty, and purpose. What more could anyone ask for?" If you've made it this far, it means you appreciated this story. Leave a comment saying, "I watched here so I can get to know you and see who truly follows the channel." Don't forget to subscribe to learn more stories like this one, stories that uncover forgotten dimensions of our shared humanity. Leave a like to support this work of historical documentation and share this with someone who values understanding human experiences in all their complexity.